Why would a baroness run from her own name? Samuel Pike's horse stopped abruptly, hooves freezing mid-step, as if the animal sensed something more than smoke, something deeper, darker, a trace of death woven into the wind. Its ears flicked uneasily, nostrils flaring, and Samuel Pike felt the shift before his mind caught up. Smoke curled low to the ground, not thick but clinging, acrid, heavy, like the remnants of a curse too old to name but too stubborn to lift. He swung down from the saddle, boots landing with a crunch against the blackened earth, the brittle remains of what had once been wood and wagon wheels and life. The air reeked of scorched canvas and burnt oats. Before him, the wagon lay in ruin, its wooden frame twisted and shattered, ribs splintered open like a carcass picked clean. The canvas hung in ribbons, fluttering weakly in the heat, like torn flesh fluttering from bone. Bodies were scattered across the ground, frozen in disjointed stillness. Men and women, even children, their faces turned away, cloaked in ash and shadow. It was as if the very dirt had chosen not to remember their features, as if the land itself recoiled from bearing witness. There were no bullet holes, no blood pooling in the dirt, just stillness and silence, thick, final, unrelenting. Samuel Pike moved forward slowly, each step careful, his fingers grazing the stock of his rifle not out of fear, but instinct. This wasn't the kind of death that announced itself with noise. This was something worse, something deliberate. Then, a sound, or maybe the memory of one. A whisper, so faint it might have been imagined. He turned toward the wreckage, stepping around charred spokes and blackened beams until he saw her. Tucked beneath a scorched wheel, almost invisible beneath soot and shadow, was a woman. Her body curled in tight, protective instinct, and her face was smeared with ash, lips cracked, hair matted with dust. But her chest rose, once then again. She was alive. Somehow, one hand clutched a pearl-buttoned glove, held like a relic, a piece of something too delicate for a scene this brutal. The glove, faintly stained with dirt, seemed out of place amidst the carnage, a fragile symbol of a life once untouched by such violence. She was breathing, but barely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, the kind that spoke of pain too great for words, of a soul barely clinging to the remnants of life. Samuel Pike crouched beside her, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked at the broken figure before him. He didn't hesitate, reaching down and gently lifting her from the dirt. She weighed less than he expected, lighter than a woman of her age and stature should have been. Her frame was too thin, too fragile, as if the grief and suffering she had endured had already hollowed her out, leaving only a shell of who she once was. The weight of it pressed on his chest, tightening his throat. He held her close, feeling the faint tremor in her breath, the way her body shivered despite the heat of the day. The horse beneath him shifted restlessly, uneasy with the new burden, but he urged it forward with a firm grip on the reins. The world around them seemed to blur, the landscape stretching out in waves, the earth beneath them solid yet distant. As they turned west, the sky bled into dusk, painting the horizon in streaks of red and orange. It was as though the heavens themselves were mourning, the colors of the dying day cutting across the sky like a wound that refused to close, refusing to heal. Samuel Pike didn't speak. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating, as though the air itself held its breath. He didn't know who she was, nor did he know what kind of story she carried in the silence of her breath, the weight of her past hidden behind the veil of her pain. But even in that silence, a question burned in him, one that he couldn't quite ignore, no matter how much he tried. Who are you? What kind of hell did you leave behind? A hell so dark that it could strip a person of everything, of their strength, the will to fight, their very sense of self. As the horse's hooves echoed softly in the quiet of the evening, The question lingered in the space between them, unanswered, but no less urgent. Days slipped by like dust through cracks, and still she said nothing. She drifted through the hours in silence, a figure carved from smoke and ash, barely touching the world around her. She ate little, picking at food with fingers that trembled when they thought no one watched. She slept with a stillness that unnerved Samuel Pike. Not like rest, but like surrender, the kind of sleep that belongs more to the dead than the living. At night, he would sit nearby, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, each breath a fragile tether that held her to this side of existence. He counted them in silence, like prayers measured and desperate, as if any moment they might stop. When she finally broke the silence, it was not with confession, but with denial. Her voice emerged hoarse, barely a thread, fragile and thin like it had been strained through years of silence and unspoken truths. It was the kind of voice spun from trauma, brittle with a false calm, a feigned indifference that did nothing to mask the pain simmering beneath. "I don't remember," she said, the words leaving her lips like a fragile lie. Samuel Pike saw the deceit before the words even took shape. He saw it in the tightness of her jaw, clenched so hard it seemed to hurt her, like a wound that had scabbed over the wrong way, still bleeding beneath the surface. It was there in the way her gloved hand remained curled at her side, not just by chance, but as if she still gripped something invisible, something she couldn't let go of. Grief, maybe, or rage, or the memory of a life she had tried so desperately to leave behind. Whatever it was, it had carved her hollow, but not clean. The remnants of it still clung to her like a shadow, impossible to shed. She didn't look at him, not really. She looked at everything else in the room as though it might explode at any moment. The kettle on the stove, the portrait of his late wife on the wall, the rifle leaning by the door. Her eyes lingered too long on each thing, not with curiosity, but with a kind of calculating awareness, as though she was measuring them, assessing them, preparing herself for something she knew was coming but refused to acknowledge. She was always waiting, always anticipating the next blow, the next moment of danger, as if she had learned long ago that safety was only an illusion. Samuel Pike, watching her from where he stood, tried a simple question. His voice was steady, neutral, as though he wasn't trying to pry, just try to understand. "Name." The word hung in the air between them, but she hesitated, too long, too tense, for it to be anything but a loaded pause. When she finally spoke, the answer came slow and deliberate. Not one I'd use. That was all. No explanation, no hint of the story behind it. Just those few words, wrapped in mystery and a subtle warning. She gave nothing more, as if she were sealing herself away again, locking up whatever part of herself she had almost allowed to surface. Samuel Pike nodded, though the motion felt mechanical, a small gesture to signify his understanding. Though in truth he didn't understand anything at all. The weight of her words hung in the air, thick with the history she had refused to share, and a tension coiled deep within him, growing tighter with each passing moment. It wasn't the words themselves, but the silence that followed, that gnawed at him, pulling at his insides like a rope drawn too taut. That silence stretched between them, stretching long and heavy, laden with things that neither of them dared to speak aloud. There were too many questions, too many things unsaid, buried beneath the surface. Why flinch at thunder that hadn't yet cracked? Why did her hands tremble when the wind shifted, when shadows played across the walls? Why trace invisible piano keys in the dirt, humming fragments of melodies she had never heard him play? Her every gesture seemed to betray something hidden beneath the surface, something fractured, something she didn't want to face. The way she moved, the way her gaze would dart away from his too quickly, the way her shoulders were always a little too stiff, like a person bracing for an inevitable storm, a storm she could feel coming but refused to acknowledge. It was a defense, a shield against the memories she couldn't escape. Even in her resistance, in the way she tried to bury whatever lay behind those unspoken words, it clung to her like smoke, an intangible thing that was impossible to wash away. No matter how much she tried to outrun it, no matter how many layers of silence she piled on top, the past wouldn't loosen its grip on her. It followed her relentlessly, winding around her like an invisible shackle, a chain forged from forgotten grief and a story she couldn't bear to tell. And in the quiet, in those fleeting moments when her guard slipped, Samuel Pike could see the weight of it in the way she carried herself, as if every movement was calculated to keep something locked away. By the third week, something within her began to stir, quietly, without drama, like a flame coaxed back to life. One morning, without asking, without glancing his way, she stood up and walked to the door. Samuel Pike's old coat hung loosely on her shoulders, too big. It seemed worn, it scent faintly like cedar in time. It swallowed her frame like armor too long forgotten, but she wore it with a strange kind of grace. On the threshold, she paused. Her bare feet met the cold wood. Her hair lifted in the wind, tugged loose by the breath of the open land. The prairie stretched before her, vast, endless, brutally honest. No hiding there, no walls to press against, just sky and wind and truth. "I needed to see the sky," she whispered, voice so soft it might have been the wind itself speaking. Samuel Pike joined her, but said nothing. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fill the silence. Some silences weren't empty. They were sacred. A few days later, he came back from town with something she hadn't asked for, something she hadn't spoken aloud, but had revealed nonetheless. In the way her fingers danced unconsciously in the dirt, playing songs only she could hear. It was a piano, dusty, scarred, with ivory keys yellowed by sun and time. It had no right to still hold music, but he brought it home, lashed it to the wagon, hauled it through the door. She didn't touch it that night, or the next. She sat before it in silence, staring like it was a memory made real. Her fingers hovered over the keys, tracing them like one might trace a scar. Relearning, reclaiming. And then, under the quiet veil of moonlight, with the fire's soft crackle as the only companion to the night, the first sound broke free from her, a sound unlike any other. It wasn't polished, nor was it practiced. It was raw, unguarded, and pure. Notes trembled on the air, as delicate and fleeting as breath in the cold. They were a melody, pieced together from memory, woven from threads of instinct rather than skill. The sound itself seemed to waver, fragile in its clarity, like something too precious to hold too tightly. She played with her eyes closed, as if afraid that if she opened them, the music might scatter, might vanish like a dream too close to the waking world. The soft, uncertain chords filled the room, an echo of something long buried, and for a moment, the cabin felt smaller, the world outside forgotten. When she finished, the silence that followed was full, thick with the weight of what she had just shared. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but she didn't move to pull them away. Her voice, quiet and unsure, broke the stillness, as if the words themselves were a quiet revelation. "Did you know music could feel like breath?" she asked, her words barely a whisper against the night. Samuel Pike didn't answer, not because he didn't agree, but because the truth of her question struck him too deeply. His throat tightened, his chest constricted, and the weight of her music clung to him. The emotions that swelled within him didn't have words. He nodded instead, his jaw tight, his heart suddenly too full. His own breath seemed to catch in the quiet that followed. Her question hung there, suspended in the air between them, heavier than the silence that surrounded it. It was the kind of question that didn't just ask for an answer, but for understanding, for recognition of something vast and unspoken. Who was she before all of this? Before the brokenness, the fear, the scars that clung to her like smoke? The answer, he realized, wasn't something she would give easily. It was locked behind the careful barriers of her hands and her music, a story wrapped in shadows and unplayed notes. The melody she had created, that fragile thing, was the closest thing to a revelation she might allow. And even then, it felt incomplete, like the last note of a song that refused to end, its echo lingering in the air just out of reach. The days stretched on in the same quiet routine, each morning blending into the next. Yet there was something in the air, something unspoken, that felt different now. Their movements had grown synchronized, like two halves of a machine quietly clicking into place. She sewed curtains with steady hands, her needle darting in and out, each stitch an act of reclamation. The curtains, though plain and practical, became a statement in their own right, softening the edges of the room, the sharp corners of the world outside. He carved drawer handles in silence, the wood giving under his knife, each curve and groove instinctive like breathing. The cabin took shape, not just in the physical sense, but in the way their presence began to fill it, filling it with quiet, with work, and with the slow, patient unraveling of each other. But then, that morning, when the light was just beginning to creep over the hills, something shifted. She stood at the ridge, her silhouette cut against the sky, her back straight and still. The wind stirred the edges of her coat, and the prairie spread wide in every direction, an empty canvas stretching forever. She seemed to be searching for something out there, something beyond the horizon that Samuel Pike couldn't see. "I used to be called Lena," she said, her voice barely carrying over the wind, as though testing the name on her tongue. It was a name that sounded foreign in the air between them, like a relic from time and place that no longer existed. A name that belonged to a woman he didn't know, a woman who had been something, someone before she came here. He didn't respond immediately. He simply stood beside her, letting the silence fill the space between them. He didn't need to say anything. He understood that she wasn't asking for comfort or answers. She was simply letting it out, something heavy from the past that needed to be released. When she finally spoke again, it was softer, more uncertain. "I don't know what I am now." She turned away from the ridge, her gaze searching the ground at her feet. The words felt like a confession, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. He didn't press her for more. There were things better left unsaid. Yet, as they went about their day, working together without speaking, he noticed the small things, the way she moved, how effortlessly her hands knew what to do, how her fingers flew over the fabric and the potatoes with practiced precision. It was in the way she hummed French lullabies as she worked, her voice barely a whisper, a song half remembered. It was a melody, sweet and sorrowful from a time long past. He couldn't help but wonder where that song had come from. It seemed so at odds with the life she now lived, the simple, harsh work of ranch life. Why would someone who had known the softness of lace, the smoothness of a piano's ivory keys, choose this life? Why would someone with such grace, such elegance, run from it all? There was a depth to her, layers of past and pain that he had yet to understand, but he wasn't about to ask. The question, though, stayed lodged in his chest like a splinter, nagging, aching. He thought of the way she had looked at the horizon, as if something out there had once meant everything to her, and now it was a memory fading under the weight of time. He thought of the way her hands moved, graceful, skilled, like she had once held something far more delicate than dirt and wood. But Lena, or whatever name she now carried, was a woman forged by circumstances. She had once worn lace and played melodies that were now ghosts in the wind. Now, she wore Samuel Pike's coat, and her hands, though still graceful, were calloused by the earth. She had survived something, survived enough to make her unrecognizable in ways he couldn't yet fathom. And yet, beneath all the silence, beneath the dust and the work, she was still Lena. Still someone who hummed songs of faraway places, Someone who carried more than her past in the way she moved, in the way she lived. But who had she been before the dust, before the war? And what did she run from? The questions lingered, unspoken, as they moved in their quiet rhythm, side by side, working, surviving, two people bound by their own untold stories, each lost and found in their own way. The door creaked softly behind her as she stepped inside, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on the cabin, thick with unsaid words. Her breath came in shallow, quick bursts, as if the mere act of speaking her truth had left her winded. Samuel Pike stood by the hearth, the soft crackle of the fire filling the silence that had stretched too long. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes were soft, patient, and they watched her as if waiting for something more to come, though he had no idea what. She set her coat aside, still lost in the echo of the store and the harsh words the man had thrown at her. Baroness. The title clung to her skin, to the very air around her, and she hated it. It was a life she had long ago rejected, a life she had thought was dead. I ran, she repeated, almost as if she were trying to convince herself, her voice wavering under the weight of the confession. I ran because I couldn't breathe there, couldn't stand the life they carved out for me, not the marriage they promised, not the man I was supposed to be bound to. Her words spilled out in a rush, raw and unguarded. My father wanted to control everything. My future, my choices. He made me into something I wasn't, forced me to wear that name like a shackle. But I couldn't do it anymore. Her hand trembled as she traced the edge of the table, her fingers lingering over the worn wood like it might provide her some comfort, some semblance of peace. Lena Tillman, she whispered again, the name tasting bitter in her mouth. She let out a hollow laugh, one devoid of any real humor. Lena Tillman is dead. She's gone. She's nothing but a memory in someone else's mind. The room felt impossibly small now, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating her with the weight of all the decisions she had made to get here. To escape, to leave everything behind. But with each step, it felt like there was a price she had to pay. Samuel Pike's silence hung in the air like a thread between them. His gaze never wavered, but he wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he didn't need to say anything at all. She wasn't asking for absolution. She wasn't asking for him to fix anything. She just needed to be heard, to have someone witness the weight of all that she carried. The story that had been forced upon her. The past that she couldn't outrun, no matter how far she fled. She finally turned to him, her face softening, but there was still a storm in her eyes. I burned my name to ash, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Because it didn't fit. Because it wasn't me. I didn't want to be her anymore. I didn't want to be them, either. Samuel Pike stepped closer, the weight of her words settling deep within him. There was a darkness in her, a part of her past that no one, not even him, would ever fully understand. But there was also something unbreakable in her. She had fought for her life, even when it meant leaving everything behind, even when it meant running from her own name. The space between them was filled with the quiet hum of the fire and the distant call of the wind outside. But there was an understanding now, something unspoken. He had his own ghosts, his own burdens, but for a moment, they weren't the center of this world. It was her story that took precedence. You've got nothing to prove here, he said finally, his voice low but firm, his eyes steady. Whatever you were, whoever you were, that doesn't matter now. This, he motioned to the cabin, to the life they had built here together. This is what matters now. And you've already built it, piece by piece. Her eyes softened as she took a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders releasing, even if just a little. She didn't know if she believed him, not entirely. But his words settled in her chest like something real, something true. The past was always going to be a part of her, always going to be a shadow on the horizon, but she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I didn't know if I could ever be anything else, she murmured, the quiet admission barely audible. I didn't know if I could ever leave it behind. But I'm trying. I'm learning how to breathe again." Samuel Pike nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. There were no simple solutions, no easy answers. The past didn't just vanish, but perhaps, just maybe, in this space, in this silence, in this life they were building, there was room for her to become something new. Someone new. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the fire flickered, steady and warm. And for the first time in a long while, Lena, no, she felt something like peace. Something soft and quiet, like the memory of a song she thought she'd forgotten. The dawn was still pale, the sky barely touched by the first hints of light when the rider appeared. He rode fast, the pounding of his horse's hooves cutting through the stillness of the morning like a drumbeat, quick and purposeful. There was something about him that set the air on edge. His posture too stiff, too practiced, the gleam of his polished revolver catching the early sun, a subtle but unmistakable threat. He slowed as he approached, his gaze locking onto Lena like a predator fixing its sights on prey. Lena, he called her name with an almost mocking familiarity, savoring the syllables as though they tasted sweeter on his tongue than anything else. Samuel Pike stepped forward, his boots heavy on the earth beneath him. His hand remained close to his rifle, but he didn't draw it. The man's smirk only deepened, confident, like he held all the cards. "Important people want her back," he said, his voice smooth, the words hanging in the air with a weight that Lena knew all too well. "That's unpaid. She belongs to them." Lena's shoulders tensed, and without a second thought, her voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. "I owe nothing. I gave up that name," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. There was no hesitation, no doubt. She had severed herself from the past, from the shackles of a life she never chose, and no one, no matter how high they ranked, would drag her back into it. The rider's hand twitched toward his holster, the motion a warning, but Samuel Pike didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, as if he were already anticipating the storm. The stillness around them thickened, and the tension seemed to stretch on, an unspoken promise that neither of them would back down. Finally, Samuel Pike spoke, his voice low but commanding, filled with an unyielding certainty. "She's not going," he said. "Not now. Not ever." The man's smirk faltered just for a moment. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the rider's eyes darkened. He spat to the side, a silent gesture of defiance, before pulling the reins of his horse, turning sharply. The sound of hooves echoed across the empty landscape as he rode off, leaving nothing but dust in his wake. But Lena didn't relax. Her hands, which had held so steady moments before, trembled now, the tremor in her fingers a quiet admission of the fear she hadn't allowed herself to voice. She looked to Samuel Pike, her face pale, the weight of the encounter settling in her bones like a cold, familiar ache. "He'll return," she whispered, her voice raw, a quiet certainty in her words. "With worse." The fear in her eyes was more than just the recognition of the rider's threat. It was the knowledge that this was far from over. The past wasn't done with her, not by a long shot, and neither were the people who had once owned her. Samuel Pike's jaw tightened, but he didn't need to say anything. He had already made his promise, and no matter what came next, he would stand firm beside her. The air between them thickened with that unspoken vow, one not of words, but of action. He had already chosen his side, and so had she. That night, the air was still, the moon high and full as Lena moved quietly, almost reverently, beneath the cottonwood tree. The ground was cool under her fingers as she dug, the dirt falling away in soft clumps. She worked with purpose, her movements steady, like she had done this before, like this was something that had been long overdue. When the hole was deep enough, she pulled from her chest a gold ring, its band delicate and well-worn, the pale blue stone at its center shimmering faintly in the moonlight, as though it held the last of the sky's fading light. The ring had once been a part of her life, a symbol of a past she could never return to, and she had known for a while now that it had no place in the life she was building. She buried it deep, pressing the earth over it with her hands, sealing that part of her away, as if burying a piece of her soul along with it. "That part of me is gone," she whispered into the night, the words light but heavy with finality. Her gaze lingered on the spot, the earth now silent and still, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had shed. Samuel Pike stood beside her, silent, understanding. He reached out without a word and took her hand, his touch warm against the chill of the evening air. She squeezed his fingers, and without a single glance back, they made their way back to the cabin, the night air cool on their skin as the world seemed to hold its breath. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows on the walls. She sat before the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she played, a song that was both fierce and new, the notes strong, confident, and sure, carrying a fire that had only just begun to burn inside her. The sound filled the small room, filling every corner with its energy, as though it were a declaration, a reclaiming of something long lost. Each note was a step away from who she had been, and towards something she was becoming. When the music ceased, the silence hung heavy between them. But this time it was different. There was no more hesitation in her. She stood, walked toward him, and as he looked at her, she saw something in his eyes, something raw, something certain. Without thinking, she leaned into him, and when their lips met, it wasn't born from desperation, but from resolve, a promise, a decision, a joining of two people who had been tested and were now choosing each other with eyes wide open. "Marry me," she whispered against his lips, the words soft but certain, as though it was the only thing left to say, the only thing that made sense in the stillness of the moment. His answer was immediate, without a second's hesitation. 1,000 lifetimes. The words were more than just an affirmation. They were a vow, a promise to face whatever came together. The world outside might have been uncertain, but in that moment, they had found something solid, something to hold on to. They had found each other, and that was enough. Under the cottonwood tree, they wed without vows. The ceremony was simple, almost sacred in its quietness. Her dress was handmade, the fabric soft but sturdy, the stitches uneven, each one a testament to a life rebuilt from fragments. His boots, worn from years of work, scratched against the earth as he stood beside her, the weight of the past and present settling into their bones. The wind, which had carried so many stories of pain and loss across the plains, seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself was watching, waiting for the moment to pass. No grand promises were made, no elaborate words spoken, just a quiet exchange of what they had, what they were, two people who had weathered storms and come out on the other side, stronger and more whole for it. Afterward, they sat together on the porch, the night air cool and comforting against their skin. The stars overhead twinkled in their endless pattern, indifferent to the small, intimate world they had created. She turned to him, the shadows of the past still clinging to her, and asked the question that had been haunting her thoughts for days. Will the past come back? The uncertainty in her voice was brief, barely there, but enough to make her heart tighten. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the stars, his gaze steady, as if searching for something beyond the vastness of the sky. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low but unwavering. "Maybe, but it won't find us waiting." His words were simple, yet they held the weight of everything they had been through. It wasn't about escaping the past. It was about not letting it dictate their future. They would face whatever came, but they would do it on their own terms, together. She smiled, her lips curving slightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the worry in her eyes began to fade. "It'll find us living," she replied softly, her voice carrying a certainty that mirrored his. The past had shaped them, yes, but it would not define them. What mattered now was the life they were building, the moments they had yet to experience. In the distance, a lone horse stamped its hooves, the sound of its movements a soft rhythm against the stillness of the night. The prairie sighed, a long, deep breath that seemed to echo the quiet peace settling between them. Two souls, stitched together by scars and silence, now claimed the sky as their own. Together, they had faced the ghosts of their past, and in the process had forged something stronger than fear, something that could stretch wider than the horizon itself. What ghosts remained? Perhaps none. For love, like the endless sky above them, was larger than anything they had left behind. And it was all they needed now.